This is Flash Fiction lesson number 11, and the subject of today's lesson is metaphor. So the lesson aims are similar to the simile lesson aims in that the aim is to understand what a metaphor is and what it does, and to practice creating metaphors in your own writing. As an example, if you go back to we're thinking about the first aim about what a metaphor is. On the first slide, you'll see a picture of a wolf with a sheep's body, and you may remember the metaphor, which is also a figure of speech. The metaphor, a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's just there as a sort of starting example. Okay, so if we look at the quotation at the top of this slide, it says, metaphors have a way of holding the most truth in the least space. So let's just think about that a minute. If we go back to the original slide, the one with the wolf in sheep's clothing, now that's quite a small amount of space in terms of words, isn't it? A wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay, so it doesn't use, there's not many words used, but if you were to explore what a figure of speech like that, a metaphor, suggests about somebody, then you might come up with words like, it suggests that they're devious, you can't trust them, they might betray you, there's two sides to them, on the outside they appear to be gentle and passive, but underneath they're ruthless and violent. Now, all those things that I've just said, i.e., there's a lot of detail about a person or a character, but you've compressed them, you've squeezed them into the least space, which is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And another way people describe metaphor, a bit like the tip of an iceberg. So most of an iceberg is under the water, so what you see above the sea level is actually just the tip of it. And if you think of the metaphor as being the tip above the water level, and the vast amount of ice below the surface is all the meanings that you can get out of that metaphor. Okay, so all right, so that's to sort of just think about a metaphor and it's how powerful they can be, I suppose. Right, so simile, if we go back, metaphors and similes are very similar and do a similar job, but they are quite different. So a simile describes something by comparing it to something else. Okay, you put like or as in the middle of something. You say like X is like Y, or Y is as something as X. Okay, you have like or as in the middle, almost like a kind of equal sign or something in a simple equation, X equals Y. All right, whereas a metaphor, the thing that you're describing sort of changes. So if you look at the example, similarly, he was as slippery as an eel. We've had that example before. But a metaphor, you don't have like or as in it. You just say he was a slippery eel. So the person that you're describing becomes the thing that you're comparing it to. There's a kind of merger of those two things. All right. Okay, we're going to attempt a metaphor task now. So task 11.1, creating a metaphor to describe an object. So step 1, choose something ordinary. So a chair, a tree, a door, whatever you like, okay? And then think of qualities that the object has, or things that it reminds you of. So a quality means, so for example, if it's a chair, it might mean its colour, its shape, its texture if you touch it, whether it's old, what it's made of, and things that it reminds you of. That will help with your metaphor. So depends on the chair, doesn't it? It might remind you of some other object, maybe, well, you'll see in my example, I think mine reminds me of a toadstool. But, so maybe list sort of 3 or 4 things that it reminds you of, as well as the qualities that it has. You'll see an example on the next slide. So here's my example that I'm going to base, this is the image of an object, of a chair, that I'm basing my own example on, and you'll see on the next slide some notes about that. It might help you to have maybe get an image off of Google Images, unless you've got, or maybe something in the home or whatever, or use your imagination if it works better than mine clearly does. But be flexible, choose something that you want to work with, and an example on the next slide. So here we are, here's my list of qualities and things that the chair reminds me of. So it's shiny, smooth in places, a few wrinkles, it's squat, made me think of chocolate cake, a toadstool and brown bread. There we are. And then, so what I've done is I then worked those qualities and images into a metaphor. The chair was, remember it's got to be, the thing you're describing has to become something else. So the chair was a squat, chocolate coloured toadstool. There we are. I don't know what you think of that. It's okay, isn't it? But as long as you understand what I mean. Okay, right, we're going to get straight on with another task. So in the previous task, what we did was we took an object, we thought about the qualities that that object had, we compared that object to other things, and we used that information to create a metaphor. In this task, you're going to take a simile, so you're going to create a simile first of all, and then you're going to convert that into a metaphor. You can either create a simile or you can find a simile from somewhere, Google a simile, take a simile you've used previously, up to you, okay? Where you get it from doesn't really matter. So, number one, make or find a simile. So the one I've got here is the sweating cheese blistered like tarmac. A bit of a strange image, I suppose, but you know, sometimes cheese can kind of get a bit damp, can't it? And it can sort of start to kind of split and what have you. So I'm choosing a, you know, perhaps on a hot day, taking it out for a picnic or something, you open it up and you think, oh, I don't really like the look of that. So I'm not going for a positive image here. It's the sweating cheese blistered like tarmac. So, you know, sometimes on a road, if it's very hot, the tarmac will start to crack and come away and become very sticky. And there we go. Right, so sounds great, doesn't it? So anyway, number two, so cut out the word like or as. So as I said before, in a simile, like or as joins the two parts of the simile. So in this one, we're going to take out the simile because we're working from simile to metaphor. So we're going to get rid of like, and then it becomes the sweating cheese blistered tarmac. Okay, it doesn't make any sense now, does it? So we've got to make it make some sense. So number three, what we're going to do is we're going to move the image, which is the thing that we're is our metaphor, is what we're describing the cheese as, which was blistered tarmac, and we're going to move that to the front of the statement. Okay, so the blistered tarmac is at the end, and now we're going to move it to the front, the blistered tarmac. Okay, and then we're going to put the word cheese at the end of it. Okay, the blistered tarmac cheese. So what I've done there is I've turned that simile into the metaphor, and now I've described cheese as though it is blistered tarmac. All right, so the cheese, which is what I'm describing, has become blistered tarmac, and I've done that by sort of going in reverse by starting off with a simile, cutting out the word like or as, and then reordering it so that we have a metaphor. Okay, so I'd like you to have a go at doing that yourselves. Remember, you can get the simile from wherever you like. You can Google one. If you just Google list of similes, you've used one in the previous lesson. You could use that. It's up to you. Okay. Okay, so we're gonna carry on with another task. They're coming thick and fast in this lesson, aren't they? So, task 11.3. So it's called the furniture game. I'll explain that in a sec. We've been looking at metaphors to describe objects. We've had some cheese and a chair. Now we're going to look at people and how metaphors can describe people. So, some of you may have heard of the furniture game before, I don't know. But the furniture game will be fully explained, but just if I introduce that game, it's the name of an activity that creates metaphors. And you create these metaphors by asking questions about a person. Okay, so for example, if this person were a piece of furniture, what piece would they be? Okay, that's why it's called the furniture game. Okay, so it will be explained on the next slide or two. Okay, so you'll see how many we've got. We've got 3 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. So that's 18 objects. And the purpose of creating this table is to These will form the basis of some questions that you will ask of your person in order to create some metaphors about them. Okay, so add to this list yourself. See if you can add another couple of rows. So maybe another 6 things, or maybe another 3 rows, and you have a further 9 things altogether. Okay, and you'll select from these words to create some questions on the next slide. Okay, on this slide, what we're going to do is I'm going to give an example first of all. We're trying to describe a person using metaphor, and I've chosen an Irish rugby player, okay, as the person I'm going to describe using metaphor, and we're going to do that by asking lots of questions about this person. So if you go back to the previous slide, all those words on that table, one of the words was drink. So I'm going to use that to start with. So if he was a drink, what drink would he be? Now I've gone for whiskey. Whiskey just happened to be there is an Irish whiskey, and I've spelt whiskey with an e at the end there, which is the Irish version of whiskey. So it's a drink that you associate with Ireland. It's quite strong and sharp, and it feels like a masculine drink. I know I'm in the world of gender stereotypes there, folks, but for the purposes of my example, I'm going to choose whiskey. All right, and then the second example, again going back to my table, one of the categories in that table was weather. So if the Irish rugby player was the weather, what kind of weather would he be? And I've gone for rainy. Okay, now I've done that because Ireland is known. It's a very green. It's called the Emerald Isle because it's very green, and the reason it's very green because it has a very high rainfall. So I just felt that Irish rain would work well, not necessarily negatively, but kind of quite positive. I think rain's very life giving, isn't it? It's water. Without water, we don't survive. So I'm seeing that as a very positive image, not a gloomy kind of rainy, but a really positive, life giving rainy. Okay, so then from that, I'm going to create a series of statements, a kind of list of statements about the rugby player. So here we go. Number 1, he is a slug of whiskey from a hip flask. Number 2, a shamrock on a rainy day. Number 3, a body swerve in a phone box. I'll explain that in a minute. Number 4, a mountain in an avalanche. So the first two, you can see how I've said he is something. He is a slug of whiskey. A slug means a kind of, swig, and a hip flask is it's a little often made of silver, some kind of metal, not silver, but they're kind of metal small flasks that you sometimes see people go out hunting or shooting, or to rugby matches might have with them maybe to keep out the cold while they're outside. So he's a slug of whiskey from a hip flask, and then with rain, I've decided to extend that a bit and thought, well, shamrock, that's sort of the symbol of Ireland, and I sort of grow this metaphor. So he's a shamrock on a rainy day. Okay, so I haven't said he is rain. I could have done if I was just keeping it simple, but I've gone for he's a shamrock on a rainy day. So I've developed the idea, and then two other examples that I have. He's a body swerve in a phone box. So what I thought there, rugby players, they have to they change direction, don't they, in very small spaces. So I thought, well, phone box, that you can't get much smaller than a phone box. Not that we have that many nowadays, but a body swerve in a phone box would be quite amazing because there's no room to do it. And I thought that would work quite well. So he's a body swerve in a phone box, and then finally he's a mountain. I think one of the categories on the table was about natural features, and I thought, well, rugby players, they're all big and tough, aren't they? So a mountain. But he's not just a mountain. I could have said he is a mountain, but I've added something, haven't I? I've added in an avalanche. I've made it even more dramatic by adding an avalanche. I could have just said, on the previous example, he is a body swerve. But in a phone box makes it a bit more dramatic. Okay, so your task is to do something similar. All right, there'll be a bit more explanation on the next slide. Okay, so here are your final instructions to create your metaphor about or your metaphors about your person. So think of someone you know, either somebody you know in person, or you could choose somebody famous. from history or sport or celebrity or whatever you want. And you're going to describe them in terms of the items on the list. Okay, and what I mean by that, the items on that orange table, which you've hopefully added to. Okay, so firstly, use questions in the following form and select categories from those listed above. So what I mean by that is, um, I've given you some things to start you off, some questions. So I've got a musical instrument, time of day, an animal, and a car. Okay, so use that object to construct a question. If this person was a musical instrument, what instrument would they be? Okay, and you'll see the other examples underneath. And when you've answered, remember, keep going back to that orange table, which you've hopefully added to. When you have about 10 to 12 questions, work on them a little bit in the way that I worked on my images. So remember, I had a metaphor that if what type of drink was the rugby player, and I put whiskey, but I added to that, didn't I? I said, well, what type of whiskey? Is a slug of whiskey from a hip flask. Okay, so see if you can develop your metaphor a little bit. Look at the way I've developed it. On two of the examples, I've said he is a body swerve in a phone box in an avalanche. Okay, so I've started a phrase beginning with in and with Shamrock on. Okay, so think of phrases that begin like that or similar. Technically, they're called prepositional phrases, so they're prepositions. They're to do with position. An avalanche, a mountain in an avalanche. In is telling you the position of the mountain. It's in an avalanche, and a body swerve in a phone box. Okay, so you might think of some other prepositions that you can start some statements with. So what I'll do is I'll put on the end of this slide some prepositions, some examples to show you how to construct those or extend those metaphors. Okay, so when you've answered 10 to 12 and you've you've grown them, you've developed the metaphor, you've extended them in the way I've just mentioned. Choose the best you like. I don't know, it's up to you how many you choose. You might choose 6, you might choose 8. Cut out the ones that don't really work and then put them in whatever order you like, and that's your not the furniture game metaphor list to describe your person. Okay. Okay, I thought I'd just pause for a moment and talk about these prepositional phrases that I was talking about. So, if you remember, these are phrases that are used to explain the position of something. So, in my examples, I had a mountain, and it was in an avalanche. Okay, so the position of the mountain was in an avalanche. So, on this slide are list 4 columns of prepositions. Okay, some that we've seen from the examples that I've used. In's not on here, but we've got on and from, which were used in two of my 4 metaphors. Okay, so right. So an example at the bottom. So you could come up with. So let's imagine you're working on your metaphor, and you just decide you're going to choose what type of food would he be. So for my rugby example, I might say, if you look at the bottom here, he is a slice of beef. Okay, that could be my metaphor. He is a slice of beef. But what I've done is I thought, well, a slice of beef. I mean, they're quite thin, and so what? So I've put a thick. So I've put an adjective in front of the noun slice, and I've got thick. So I've got he is a thick slice of beef. Okay, so that's a bit better. But then what I've done is and I could have left it there. That would have been fine. That's a metaphor, isn't it? He is a thick slice of beef. But what I've done is I've extended it by putting a preposition, and I've gone for between, and then putting some more information. So he is a thick slice of beef between 2 even thicker slices of crusty wholemeal bread. There we are. I think that works more effectively now that I've used a prepositional phrase. That must mean a phrase with a preposition in it, and my phrase has got the preposition between in it. So all these words on this slide are all prepositions. Okay. No, the clue is in the word preposition. It's to do with the position of things. So my slice of beef is positioned between 2 even thicker slices of crusty wholemeal bread. Okay. All right. Okay, on this final slide, there's the main point about. There's a few more thoughts about your metaphors that you're doing for your character. If you want an example, the furniture game is adapted by the poet laureate Simon Armitage, and if you follow the link, which won't work on this movie, and I'll have to make sure I put it on the Google Classroom separately. But if you typed in "not the furniture game" by Simon Armitage, you'll get there. But I'll put the link on the classroom anyway. Um, it gives you an example of how a professional writer, Simon Armitage, the poet laureate, has actually worked on this idea. Okay, in fact, you might want to do that first before you go any further. See how he's done it. It's very long, but have a look at maybe one or two examples to give you a flavour of how it might look. Okay, good luck.